Welcome to Miyconst hardware. Intel LGA 2011 version 3 platform was introduced by Intel about a decade ago, but up until today it is still somehow relevant, and that's all thanks to the Chinese X99 motherboards that are available for rather cheap. With these motherboards and the Xeon E5-V3 CPUs, you can assemble very competitive budget and very budget gaming computers and workstations. Through the last few years, I have benchmarked many different Xeon E5 CPUs and also covered many different Chinese X99 motherboards. So it's not really much left to test on this platform, but still, by the end of 2024, I decided to make a massive benchmark of the recent and old games as a good farewell for this truly legendary platform. In this series, so far, I plan to have two videos. In the first one, I'm going to test the Xeon E5-2697A V4, and in the second one, I'm going to test the Xeon E5-2697 V3 with a Turbo Boost unlock. Both of the Xeons will be compared against AMD Ryzen 5 5600, as this CPU is right now pretty cheap and the AM4 motherboards are very cheap as well. So you will have at least some sort of a common reference point, the Ryzen 5 CPU, if you would want to compare the Xeon performance against other popular CPUs, because online you can find lots of different benchmarks where they compare Ryzen 5 with some other CPU. If there will be enough demand, I may consider doing the same test with some of the entry-level Xeon E5 CPUs, such as E5-2620 V3, 2640 V3, or maybe 2640 V4. Testing 40 games with the 3 different hardware configurations takes a lot of time, thus I had to make some compromises. Automatic built-in benchmarks were used whenever possible. Online shooters produce very inconsistent results, but I still had time to play only 3 rounds for each benchmark. Many story-based games are tested at the very first location, which is good enough to compare CPUs between each other, but it is not very representative for the overall performance of this particular game. If you proceed further down the story, you may receive better or worse performance in the same game. Fortnite was tested with a replay, but replays in this game usually perform better than the live gaming. Again, this is good enough to compare CPUs, but it is not representative to the actual live gaming. All games were tested at 1080p screen resolution, and if you don't understand why CPUs are tested at 1080p, please watch a great explanation from Hardware Unboxed. While testing, I have disabled all upscaling features such as DLSS, FSR, XESS where it was possible. And I tested high graphical preset in most of the games. In some games it was medium, in some games it was very high, but my focus was to shift load from the GPU to the CPU. In terms of hardware, for this test, I decided to go with the mainstream options to demonstrate the average performance achievable by most of the users. So Xeon E5 was tested with 4 sticks 8GB each, DDR4 2400 CL14, and another option 2 sticks 16GB each, also DDR4 2400 CL14. Machinist X99 RS9 motherboard, which is one of the cheapest quad-channel motherboards from AliExpress, Windows 10 and Inspector patches were applied. Ryzen 5 5600 was tested with the 2 sticks 16GB each, DDR4 3600 CL18 using cheap Soyo B550M motherboard from AliExpress, and here I used Windows 11. For the graphics card, I used my trusty AMD RX 7900 XT, and resizable bar was enabled with both of the configurations. Corsair RM850E power supply, and of course latest AMD drivers and all Windows updates were installed. Instead of covering results of every tested game individually, I grouped them into categories and will cover the results in groups. Feel free to pause the video and check for detailed FPS numbers if you would wish to. Strategy games. Here we see clear Ryzen 5 5600 dominance, with Anno 1800, City Skylines, Company of Heroes 3, Frostpunk 2 and Total War 3 Kingdoms. We see that Ryzen 5 5600 yields better minimal FPS than Xeon E5-2697A V4 can deliver on average. We get about 111–161 FPS with Ryzen 5 against 75–107 FPS with the Xeon E5. The difference between quad and dual-channel memory configuration with the Xeon E5 is barely noticeable. The next group is dedicated to cozy and racing games, and these are together mainly because I had too few of these. The overall picture is very similar to the strategy games. On average, after testing Astroneer, Coral Island, F123 and Forza Horizon 4, E5-2697 V4 is far behind Ryzen 5 5600. We get 111-160 FPS with the Xeon E5, at the same time Ryzen 5 delivers 158-221 FPS. The next group is slightly bigger, and here I cover story-driven adventure games. Here E5-2697 V4 is far more competitive. In Starfield, Assassin's Creed Mirage, Star Wars Outlaws, Alan Wake 2 and Red Dead Redemption, the performance is on par or close by to Ryzen 5 5600. It's also worth noting that in Star Wars Outlaws, Ryzen 5 5600 produces horrible 1% lows of just 9 FPS, which means the game turns into a stuttering mess in certain locations, while Xeon E5-2697A V4 delivers stable 66 1% low FPS. Then in Borderlands 3 and the Chernobylite, E5-2697A V4 is not that far behind Ryzen 5 5600, but in HITMAN 3, Horizon Zero Dawn, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, Ryzen 5 5600 is noticeably faster than its aging E5 competitor. All in all, on average in this group, E5-2697 V4 delivers 80-132 FPS, while Ryzen 5 5600 is a bit faster with its 92-153 FPS. Now let's talk about online shooters, but first I need to remind all of you that war can be fun in video games, but it's a true horror when it comes to the reality. While we enjoy our gaming, Russia continues to level up Ukrainian cities one by one. Please stand with Ukraine, stand for democracy, and Russia must be destroyed. Xeon E5-2697A V4 performance is all over the place when it comes to online shooters. Some games are very well optimized for multi-core CPUs, while others heavily rely on single-threaded performance, thus it's hard to draw a single conclusion. Let's start with an outlier, Battlefield 2042. Playing Conquest with 128 players, we see that 16-core E5-2697 V4 is significantly better than the 6-core Ryzen 5 5600. Ryzen 5 5600 utilization constantly stays at 100%, and the experience is not great. In terms of FPS, we get 74-105 with Ryzen and about 84-145 with the Xeon E5. It's also worth noting that Battlefield 2042 stutters and lags even with E5-2697A V4, even though the FPS numbers are much better. In Warzone, Apex Legends, Battlefield 4 and Fortnite, both CPUs perform very similarly. Some could wrongly assume that E5-2697A V4 performance greatly depends on the graphical API used by the game, but in this case we see that Apex Legends uses DirectX 11 API and still manages to yield great results with this old CPU. Thus, I assume it's a matter of optimization and it's not up to the API. The other tested games are Counter-Strike 2, Wolfenstein Youngblood, Rainbow Six Extraction, and Valorant clearly prefer AMD Ryzen 5 5600. Here the FPS gap is really brutal. Ryzen 5 5600 is up to 50% faster than Xeon E5-2697A V4. If I average out these drastically different results, then we can see that even in 2024, E5-2697 V4 is still not that bad. On average, we get 100-200 FPS, while Ryzen 5600 delivers 142-252 FPS. The last category to cover consists of story-driven action games. The good old Xeon E5 is pretty competitive in Stalker 2, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, Watch Dogs Legion and GTA 5. At the same time, in Cyberpunk 2077, Gears 5, Metro Exodus, Returnal and Far Cry 6, Ryzen 5 5600 is significantly faster. On average, the gap between the CPUs isn't that bad. Xeon E5 delivers 7206 FPS, and Ryzen 5 5600 is about 30% faster, with its 8930 FPS. Apart of the FPS numbers, we also need to look at the power consumption, and here it is a bit tricky because different sections of the test consume different amounts of power. Thus, I limited myself to some games where the power consumption is at least somehow stable. And just like with all my previous tests, I measure power consumption from the wall with an external watt meter. So, Ryzen 5 5600 is a much newer CPU that is expected to be much more efficient, and that's exactly what we see here. When the performance is similar, for example in Assassin's Creed Mirage, the Ryzen 5 system consumes 40-50 watts less, 390 watts against 440 watts with the Xeon E5. 50 watts is a rather significant difference, but it gets even worse when we look at the watts per FPS in the games where Ryzen is much faster. For example, in City Skylines, where Xeon struggles a lot, Ryzen 5 consumes only 2.47 watts for 1 FPS, while Xeon E5 requires more than 3.5 watts per FPS. The same can be seen in Rainbow Six Extraction. Ryzen 5 5600 system consumes only 1.11 watts per FPS, while Xeon E5 sucks 1.82 watts per FPS. It's not surprising that a much newer Ryzen 5 5600 beats the old Xeon E5-2697A V4 at almost every test. But how about the value proposition? How much do you have to pay per FPS with these CPUs? With these calculations, I cannot please everyone. Local stores, second-hand market, and AliExpress offers are different for each country. Thus, I decided to go with AliExpress prices with shipping and taxes to Sweden. As of December 2024, the tested Xeon E5 combo would cost about 170 euros, while Ryzen 5 5600 alternative sums up to about 260 euros. The price difference is almost 100 euros, which is significant. Still, if we take into account the performance, we see that both of the CPUs deliver very similar value. In single-player, story-driven and action games, E5-2697A V4 may deliver up to 25% better value. In other cases, you get what you pay for. Ryzen costs more, but you also get better performance. Well, now it's time to make some sort of a conclusion. 2025 is about to start, and LGA 2011 version 3 is still somehow relevant. E5-2697A V4 is still able to provide acceptable performance even in the latest games. At the same time, this relevance is going down with each year. Xeon E5-2697A V4 is noticeably slower than a 6-core Ryzen 5 5600. At the same time, the power consumption is significantly higher. Also, the Chinese X99 motherboards are rather questionable in quality and longevity. But what's more important is that the value proposition of Xeon E5 is not that much better than the one of Ryzen 5 5600. If we compare price against the performance, we can see that the value proposition is very close between these two options. So if you can afford buying Ryzen 5 5600, then I would strongly recommend going this way. If the budget is extremely limited, then this extra 100 euros most likely better to invest into a stronger graphics card. Finally, let's address the quad versus dual channel memory configuration debate. As you can see from my test, the two 16GB sticks sometimes perform slightly worse, sometimes perform the same, and sometimes perform even slightly better than 4 sticks 8GB each. And this is a bit unexpected for me, but essentially what happens here is that 16GB sticks are dual ranked, while the 8GB sticks are single ranked. I am not an expert in memory optimization and how CPU integrated memory controller works, but essentially what happens here is that the CPU is able to do more at the same time when a memory stick has more ranks. That's why two memory sticks, two ranks each, are about the same in gaming to four memory sticks with a single rank each. Thus, even with Machinist X99PR9 or similar motherboard that supports only two memory channels, if you use dual-ranked 16GB memory modules, you will not lose that much in terms of gaming performance. Sure, the synthetic benchmarks will always favor quad-channel memory configuration, and if you have a memory bandwidth sensitive applications, then it's always beneficial to have more memory channels rather than more memory ranks. And with this, I have to say thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I hope it was interesting and educational. Happy gaming, and I hope to see you soon.